Johnny, welcome to the chair. It's great to have you as the new music director of the Australian Ballet, as a friend and as an artistic collaborator. It's great to chat. All things Swan Lake, I guess.
Very excited at the prospect of that coming up.
Yeah. So Swan Lake is the most famous ballet ever created, apart from Nutcracker, I think. Personally. But musically, it is so rich, so full, beautiful themes, a beautiful end, apotheosis. What has been your sort of journey with Swan Lake? Is it new? Is it older? Do you feel experienced?
Yeah, it's funny with Swan Lake. Personally, this was one of the first ballets that I conducted. And since then, like with a lot of conductors who work in ballet, Swan Lake keeps coming back in your season. So I think this is going to be my fourth Swan Lake, and I'm really excited by this one because we get to do it together in many ways. We get to update it, tweak it, and in the process create something really great artistically, but also have some fun.
Yeah. It has been a bit of a journey so far, in terms of what kind of music we are inspired by, what parts we're motivated by. But speaking of that kind of motivation, where in the score are you most motivated?
That's an interesting one. You mentioned the ending, actually. Before Swan Lake, and this is one of the reasons why it's such a monumental ballet. In fact, Tchaikovsky's biographer calls it one of the most revolutionary ballet in all of ballet history, apart from The Rite of Spring, which, given what we think of Swan Lake now with those famous themes and familiarity, seems almost a bit crazy to think of it that way. But that ending, for example, and it's certainly one of the things that I look forward to the most in the ballet, not just because the pub is nearby, but because as an ending, I don't think very few composers before Tchaikovsky, in fact no composers before Tchaikovsky in ballet, dare to go that far when it comes to the dramatic and the evocative.
Really?
You think of all the Minkas and the Delibes and all that, the ending of Swan Lake really takes it beyond the purely entertainment, purely like a divert way, and really take it into the realm of the dramatic and the theatrical. With that apotheosis that you call it, that combination of all those themes building to a climax across the entire evening, but also the orchestration, where he really dared to push the envelope a little bit, so that people, in fact, even at the premiere, level this charge of the ballet being too loud at Tchaikovsky. One of the critics actually said, well, it's a ballet about swans. How dare you use all these brass and percussion instruments to represent that? But the resolution of that climax, the resolution of the personal struggle and journey that Siegfried and Odette goes through, and also Rothbard's story, and how it culminates in that moment with this big dramatic ending, but that then transcends into something much more magical, that moment that we were speaking about just the other day, with that ripple of strings, and suddenly just one horn note that comes through that texture.
So true.
Almost like the moonlight breaking through and suddenly going, it sort of shines the ending onto it. It's something really powerful.
Interestingly, as a dancer, that was a moment where you breathe this sigh of relief, because in Swan you go through such a journey. It's a long ballet, it's a heavy ballet. Technically it's very difficult, and I always remember at the end of Swan, when you're hearing that, it's this sense of like, oh my God, like of relief in a way.
And as a dancer, what's the music like to dance to? And there's a reason I asked that question.
I mean, there are definitely different parts that I think really I felt more connected to. The Prince's solo at the end of Act 1 was always just very melancholic, very a big sense of solitude. But then the discovery in Act Two, you know, bum ba-dun, da-dun, 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 and just feeling Ron Rothbart, and then seeing Odette for the first time. That was really beautiful. And then, of course, Black Swan. So presentational, so almost externalized, so euphoric in a way, because he's found his, you know, his match. And so there was this sense of like excitement to come out into Black Swan and to make this, you know, running on entrance kind of thing.
And to dig a little bit deeper into that, and what is it in the music that gives you all those excitement and drama? Because when the piece was premiered, people said it was undanceable.
Interestingly, that's how the dancers felt for Romeo and Juliet when it was first composed. And I think we've adapted. It's danceable now.
Yes.
We think it's danceable.
Yeah.
To me, it's the themes. I think the themes in the whole work are gorgeous. When the themes come back, the oboe, you know, the strings, and that's, I've always found really inspiring. But as well, I think later on in my dancing career, I would find a lot of more subtlety in music, in Swan, for example. You know, the undercurrents, the bass lines, the pulses. I find that as well, more glaringly so in Nutcracker than I would in Swan Lake. But I always, like, that's sort of what I started to play off a little bit.
It's fascinating though, because one of the charges that Tchaikovsky received from his critics at the time, who said his music was undanceable, was that, and I quote, the melodies were too confused and capricious. Isn't that interesting that we don't think of it like that now? And
Not at all.
You think of it as one of the things that really inspires you.
So then you have, you know, you have your baton, you have the orchestra. How are you taking the orchestra, therefore the audience, therefore the dancers? You have a lot of control, Johnny. How are you taking them on the journey? You know, what are you finding in the score yourself that you really bring everyone on the journey of the score?
Yeah. Of course, every ballet is different, specifically for Swan Lake. And I think it's interesting that we have this conversation right on the back of talking about themes. Is that, as you mentioned, the themes keep coming back. And so the entire score, the 2 hours of it, is something that is so tightly constructed and knit together and tied together with these themes that makes the whole evening really symphonic. So unlike ballets before Swan Lake, where they very much feel like number ballets. Yes, there's a story underneath it, but it goes this number, that number, that number, and all that. And each number is marked by a distinctive dance, or maybe a flavor, or maybe a melody. In Swan Lake, Tchaikovsky blurs that much more, so that the entire score is one narrative. And I think this is where, like you say, we really have the power in the pit to propel not just the dancing and get the tempo right and find the right flow and all that, but to propel the evening as a drama, so that even in the very beginning, the da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-da, that theme that comes back, that starts the ballet, is echoed in that same instrument, the oboe, with Odette's first appearance of bum, bum, da-dum. There's a relationship within all of that.
Yeah.
And it's really subtle, but it's little decisions like finding the phrasing so that there's an echo in the phrasing, finding the color and the texture in the orchestra, the way you play the accompaniment, so that there's an echo, so that people don't necessarily go, yes, I recognize that from the opening, but they just feel. It's almost like you stepped into a room one day, and you step into a different room and you smell the same fragrance in the room.
That's a great analogy.
Sort of feeling. And I think this is really interesting also seen from the Tchaikovsky perspective, in that when he was writing Swan Lake, he just completed the Third Symphony, which we know as Diamonds with Jewels.
Yeah.
And he'd also just been absolutely blown away by Carmen, the opera. And I think it's no coincidence that in Swan Lake he created a score that is symphonic, but it's also full of dance, because the third symphony, it's all dance movements.
It is, absolutely.
But also it's operatic in a sense that there is a dramatic logic that underpins the whole score, and therefore we are really taken on the journey by the orchestra and by what the orchestra does. You know, interestingly, that white swan pas de deux that we love with the violin solo and the cello solo is a recycled piece of music from an opera that he wrote, I think 5 years before. Exactly, it was a duet between the soprano and the tenor, and it's about the rejoicing in happiness and the joyful moment, and to have that recycled. I think he really tried to be operatic almost in this ballet.
Yeah, it's interesting because you hear that so much in Diamonds. You hear that so much in Swan. It's really nice to hear the sort of trajectory, the chronology, and how things developed. And what I think is so interesting, you said he was inspired by Carmen, or he heard Carmen, is how artists are so inspired by what's around them. And I think dancers are like that. You know, the dancers are inspired by other dancers. Tchaikovsky was inspired by, you know, as you said, Bizet or whomever else, and influenced. So who are your inspirations, your kind of conducting inspirations or musical inspirations?
I think I could stay very much in the conducting world and the conductors in the classical world, where I really admire the conductors who allow room for the musicians to play, and so that the person on the podium is there to guide rather than to dictate.
Okay.
So, you know, the real masters of that, the Haitink and the Abado, and then they go on and they don't rejoice in showmanship, and they delight in the fact that they can get the orchestra hearing and making music with each other and with them on the podium, rather than this is where I want to go with it. But to extend that, I think it happens in music all the time, and that's how music should be in many ways, as a communication between human beings. And so there's nothing quite like that, like what jazz musicians do. And you see the way they pass from solo to a solo to another. It's wonderful, and how they inspire, and they're not restricted by what's written on the page. They have the freedom just to play. And I wonder whether that's something that dancers find too, whether when you dance something you communicate with your fellow dancers on stage.
That's one of the biggest sort of criticisms I've had about classical ballet, because we are trained with this technique. And I find it is very rare when someone breaks out of that technique and has to express it in a different way. Whereas I find other dancers who dance through different styles have a much better way of impulsive or improvisational interpretation. And so my inspirations have commonly been outside of the ballet world. So I thought you were going to tell me, you know, your inspiration was maybe Andy Warhol or something. But you know, it's always nice to see, like you said, that room to breathe, that room, you know, as a conductor, or that room as a dancer, to sort of let the musicians find it themselves, and also let the dancer find it themselves.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think we are employed in art forms, classical ballet and classical music, where there is a certain degree of discipline required. And when it comes to Swan Lake, the discipline required in your quarter ballet of swans, it's incredible. How do you balance the necessity to be together with artistry that you try and inspire from the dancers?
I think it's interesting. The first time the first rehearsal I took as artistic director here was Bayadere shades. And yes, we were perfecting, that unison and that uniformity, but also this sense of individuality and pride in everyone's interpretation. And I think on the lakeside, with all of the swans, that's what I will be searching for the dancers in the company, is that, yes, that exactitude, that precision, the pride in that precision, in that uniformity, but also the pride of the self, the pride of everyone knowing that they're a vital part of the whole, that they're their own ballerina, that they are themselves amongst the group or the collective. I think that's really important for it to go from here, to have it go, swell.
And would you say that's key to keeping this piece that we all have done so much and we all know so well, the key to keeping it fresh? Or are there other ways that you're trying to get out of the company to keep this piece new and relevant and fresh?
I think there's a task to keep it fresh. It can't become a museum piece. It was done well the first time, though, and that's why we're still performing it, because it was done well. It was composed well. It was choreographed well. But I think what's so important, and you probably would agree with me, is that interpretation. Whether you are a swan at the lakeside, whether you are Odette, whether you are the prince, or whether you are a peasant, it's your interpretation that needs to be fresh, that needs to be scrutinized, that needs to be questioned.
Yeah. It's interesting because I was asked this recently by somebody about Swan Lake and how do we keep it fresh in the pit? And it is that you know what the parameters are within which you've got to stay disciplined. But beyond that, giving them the freedom to be like, you want to play this phrase like this tonight? Do it. You want to do it differently another night? Also do it. And now let's all listen to how you just played it and respond to it.
Yeah, great.
And I think that's quite a Tchaikovsky thing too. As a really bizarre aside, do you know he really loved dancing, particularly the ballerina roles? There's a wonderful story of when he moved to Moscow in order to take up a job as a professor at the Moscow Conservatoire, and one evening when everybody gone home and he was just left there with a visiting professor, Camille Saint-Saëns. And the two of them basically danced a ballet together with Nikolai Rubinstein accompanying them on the piano. And it's that sense of being given the freedom to find individuality that I think is also in Swan Lake, in that search for the self and search for that interpretation, but it's like it goes back to that, going through that journey of what Siegfried goes through and what Odile and all the characters go through, and allowing them the space to be different Siegfrieds every night between casts.
Yeah, absolutely.
That keeps it fresh.
And that's so important. It's also so important for a composer like Tchaikovsky to like dancing. That reminds me of, how Balanchine loved music, and you could tell. You can tell that Tchaikovsky loved dancing. Those partnerships, the Petipa Tchaikovsky, the Stravinsky, the Balanchine, are so lasting because they really show kind of the mutual collaboration, the mutual respect, the mutual adoration to one's art form.
And you can hear it in his music outside of Swan Lake too. It's dance everywhere. Even though we think of we think of those big melodies like the Fifth Symphony, but there's always an underlying sense of dance with which a real profound emotion is expressed. Because I think for him, when he's dancing and letting himself be swept away by music, that's when he could be most himself. And I think you can hear that.
Yeah. Well, Johnny, I can't wait to continue on the journey with you. to our opening night in September. But it's great to hear, the musical insights, your obvious passion for it. I feel like I've found a true partner in crime in a way.
And it feels like that we can really go on this journey together. We're searching for the same thing.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's nice that we do it in a, not just a purely like a really deeply serious way too.
No, it's true.
Yeah, you can be Mr. Hallberg in the day, but Bergsey in the evenings.
Oh, you've just outed me.
Well, I think you outed me as J-Lo one time, so I thought
I didn't. I
thought
didn't.
I fired back.
I wasn't the one to start calling you J-Lo, but in true form, you are a true Aussie now that you have a nickname. Same for me, calling me Bergsey. So
from this interview onwards,
I'm Bergsey.
You are.
And you're J-Lo.
There we go.
With that said, thanks for chatting, J-Lo.
It's been a pleasure, Bergsey.